Conclusions. Cinema is not a universal or primitive language system, langue, nor a language, langage. It brings to light an intelligible content, which is like a presupposition, a condition, a necessary correlate through which language constructs its own objects, signifying units and operations. But this correlate, though inseparable, is specific. It consists of movements and thought processes, pre-linguistic images, and of points of view on these movements and processes, pre-signifying signs. It constitutes a whole psychomechanics, the spiritual automaton, the utterable of a language system which has its own logic. The language system takes utterances of language with signifying units and operations from it, but the utterable itself, its images and signs are of another nature. This would be what James Febvre calls non-linguistically formed content, whilst the language system works through form and substance. Or rather, it is the first signifiable, anterior to all significance, which Guillaume made the condition of linguistics. We can understand from this the ambiguity which runs through semiotics and semiology. Semiology, which is of linguistic inspiration, tends to close the signifier in on itself and cut language off from the images and signs which make up its raw material. Semiotics, by contrast, is the discipline which considers language only in relation to this specific content, images and signs. Of course, when language takes over the content or the utterable, it makes from them properly linguistic utterances, which are no longer expressed in images and signs, but even the utterances are in turn reinvested in images and signs, and provide the utterable afresh. It seemed to us that cinema, precisely through its automatic or psychomechanical qualities, was the system of pre-linguistic images and signs, and that it took utterances up again in the images and signs proper to this system, the red image of the silent cinema, the sound components of the visual image in the first stage of the talkie, the sound image itself in the second stage of the talkie. This is why the break between the silent film and the talkie has never seemed fundamental in cinema's evolution. By contrast, what has seemed fundamental to us in this system of images and signs is the distinction between two kinds of images with their corresponding signs, movement images and time images, which were only to appear and develop later. Kinostructures and chronogeneses are the two successive chapters of a pure semiotics. Cinema, considered as psychomechanics or spiritual automaton, is reflected in its own content, its themes, situations, and characters, but the relationship is complicated because this reflection gives way to oppositions and inversions, as well as to resolutions and reconciliations. The automaton has always had two coexistent complementary senses, even when they were in conflict. On the one hand, the great spiritual automaton indicates the highest exercise of thought, the way in which thought thinks itself, in the fantastic effort of an autonomy. But on the other hand, the automaton is also the psychological automaton, who no longer depends on the outside, because He is autonomous, but because he is dispossessed of his own thought, and obeys an internal impression, which develops solely in visions or rudimentary actions, from the dreamer to the somnambulist, and conversely, through the intermediary of hypnosis, suggestion, hallucination, obsession, etc. Hence there is something specific to cinema which has nothing to do with theater. If cinema is automatism, becomes spiritual art, that is, initially movement image, it confronts automata, not accidentally, but fundamentally. The French school never lost its taste for clockwork automata and clock-making characters, but also confronted machines with moving parts. The man-machine assemblage varies from case to case, but always with the intention of posing the question of the future. And machines can take hold so fully on man that it awakens the most ancient powers, and the moving machine becomes one with the psychological automaton, pure and simple, at the service of a frightening new order. This is the procession of somnambulists, the hallucinators, hypnotizers hypnotized, in expressionism, Hitler as filmmaker, the revolutionary courtship of the movement image, and an art of the masses become subject, was broken off, giving way to the masses subjected as psychological automaton, and to their leader as great spiritual automaton. A true psychomechanics will not be found unless it is based on new associations, by reconstituting the great mental automata whose place was taken by Hitler, by reviving the psychological automata that he enslaved. The movement image, that is, the bond that cinema had introduced between movement and image from the outset, would have to be abandoned in order to set free other powers that it kept subordinate, and which had not had the time to develop their effects, projection and back projection. There is also a more general problem, where projection and back projection are only technical means, which directly carry the time image, which substitute the time image for the movement image. A return to the extrinsic point of view obviously becomes necessary. The technological and social evolution of automata, clockwork automata, but also motor automata, in short, automata of movement, made way for a new computer and cybernetic race, automata of computation and thought, automata with controls and feedback. The configuration of power was also inverted, and instead of converging on a single mysterious leader, inspirer of dreams, commander of actions, power was diluted in an information network where decision makers managed control, processing, and stock across intersections of insomniacs and seers. But new automata did not invade content without a new automatism, bringing about a mutation of form. The modern configuration of the automaton is the correlate of an electronic automatism. The electronic image, that is, the tele, and video image, the numerical image, coming into being, either had to transform cinema or to replace it, to mark its death. We do not claim to be producing an analysis of the new images, which would be beyond our aims, but only to indicate certain effects, whose relation to the cinematographic image remains to be determined. The new images no longer have any outside, out of field, any more than they are internalized in a whole. Rather, they have a right side and a reverse, reversible and non-superimposable, like a power to turn back on themselves. They are the object of a perpetual reorganization, in which a new image can arise from any point whatever of the preceding image. The organization of space here loses its privileged directions, and first of all displays in favor of an omnidirectional space, which constantly varies its angles and coordinates to exchange the vertical and the horizontal. And the screen itself, even if it keeps a vertical position by convention, no longer seems to refer to the human posture, like a window or a painting, but rather constitutes a table of information, an opaque surface, on which are inscribed data, information replacing nature, and the brain city, the third eye replacing the eyes of nature. Finally, sound achieving an autonomy which increasingly lends it the status of image. The two images, sound and visual, enter in complex relations with neither subordination nor commensurability, and reach a common limit, so far as each reaches its own limit. In all these senses, the new spiritual automatism in turn refers to new psychological automata. But we are all the time circling the question, cerebral creation or deficiency of the cerebellum. The new automatism is worthless in itself if it is not put to the service of a powerful, obscure, condensed will to art, aspiring to deploy itself through involuntary movements which nonetheless do not restrict it. An original will to art has already been defined by us in the change affecting the intelligible content of cinema itself, the substitution of the time image for the movement image, so that electronic images will have to be based on still another will to art, or on as yet unknown aspects of the time image. The artist is always in the situation of saying simultaneously, I claim new methods, and I am afraid that the new methods may invalidate all will to art, or make it into a business, a pornography, a Hitlerism. The fact is that the new spiritual automatism and the new psychological automata depend on an aesthetic before depending on technology. It is the time image which calls on an original regime of images and signs before electronics spoils it, or in contrast, relaunches it. The modern world is that in which information replaces nature. All the documents could be shown, all the testimonies should be heard, but in vain. What makes information all-powerful, the newspapers, and then the radio, and then the television, is its very nullity, its radical ineffectiveness. Information plays on its ineffectiveness in order to establish its power. Its very power is to be ineffective, and thereby all the more dangerous. This is why it is necessary to go beyond information in order to defeat Hitler, or turn the image over. Redemption, art beyond knowledge, is also creation beyond information. We can now summarize the constitution of the time image in modern cinema, and the new signs that it implies or initiates. There are many possible transformations, almost imperceptible passages and also combinations between the movement image and the time image. It cannot be said that one is more important than the other, whether more beautiful or more profound. All that can be said is that the movement image does not give us a time image. Nevertheless, it does give us many things in connection with it. On one hand, the movement image constitutes time in its empirical form, the course of time, a successive present in an extrinsic relation of before and after, so that the past is a former present, and the future a present to come. An adequate reflection would lead us to conclude from this that the cinematographic image is necessarily in the present. But this ready-made idea, disastrous for any understanding of cinema, is less the fault of the movement image than of an overly hasty reflection. For on the other hand, the movement image gives rise to an image of time, which is distinguished from it by excess or default, over or under the present as empirical progression. In this case, time is no longer measured by movement, but is itself the number or measure of movement, metaphysical representation. This number in turn has two aspects, which we saw in the first volume. It is the minimum unity of time as interval of movement, or the totality of time as maximum of movement. In the universe, the subtle and the sublime. But from either aspect, time is distinguished in this way from movement only as indirect representation. Time as progression derives from the movement image or from successive shots. But time as unity or as totality depends on montage, which still relates it back to movement or to the succession of shots. This is why the movement image is fundamentally linked to an indirect representation of time, and does not give us a direct presentation of it, that is, does not give us a time image. The only direct presentation then appears in music. But in modern cinema, by contrast, the time image is no longer empirical, nor metaphysical. It is transcendental in the sense that Kant gives this word. Time is out of joint and presents itself in the pure state. The time image does not imply the absence of movement, even though it often includes its increased scarcity. But it implies the reversal of the subordination. It is no longer time which is subordinate to movement. It is movement which subordinates itself to time. It is no longer time which derives from movement, from its norm and its corrected aberrations. It is movement as false movement, as aberrant movement, which now depends on time. The time image has become direct, just as time has discovered new aspects, as movement has become aberrant in essence and not by accident, as montage has taken on a new sense, and as a so-called modern cinema has been constituted post-war. However close its relations with classical cinema, modern cinema asks the question, what are the new forces at work in the image, and the new signs invading the screen? The first factor is the break of the sensory-motor link, for the movement image, as soon as it referred itself back to its interval, constituted the action image. The latter, in its widest sense, comprised received movement, perception, situation, imprint, affection, the interval itself, and executed movement, action, properly speaking, and reaction. The sensory-motor link was thus the unity of movement and its interval. The specification of the movement image, or the action image par excellence. There is no reason to talk about narrative cinema, which would correspond to this first movement, for narration results from the sensory-motor schema, and not the other way around. But precisely what brings this cinema of action into question after the war is the very breakup of the sensory-motor schema, the rise of situations to which one can no longer react, of environments with which there are now only chance relations, of empty or disconnected any space whatevers, replacing qualified extended space. It is here that situations no longer extend into action or reaction in accordance with the requirements of the movement image. These are pure optical and sound situations, in which the character does not know how to respond, abandoned spaces in which he ceases to experience and to act, so that he enters into flight, goes on a trip, comes and goes, vaguely indifferent to what happens to him, undecided as to what must be done, but he has gained an ability to see what he has lost in action or reaction. He sees so that the viewer's problem becomes, what is there to see in the image and not now? What are we going to see in the next image? The situation no longer extends into action through the intermediary of affections. It is cut off from all its extensions. It is now important only for itself, having absorbed all its affective intensities, all its active extensions. This is no longer a sensory-motor situation, but a purely optical and sound situation, where the seer, voyant, has replaced the agent, actant. A description. We call this type of image op signs and son signs. They appear after the war, through all the external reasons we can point to, the calling into question of action, the necessity of seeing and hearing, the proliferation of empty, disconnected, abandoned spaces, but also through the internal push of a cinema being reborn, recreating its conditions. Neorealism, New Wave, New American Cinema. But what can purely optical and sound images link up with, since they no longer extend into action? We would like to reply, with recollection images or dream images, yet the former still come within the framework of the sensory-motor situation, whose interval they are content to fill, even though lengthening and distending it, they seize of former present in the past, and thus respect the empirical progression of time, even though they introduce local regressions into it, the flashback as psychological memory. The latter, dream images, rather affect the whole. They project the sensory-motor situation to infinity, sometimes by ensuring the constant metamorphosis of the situation, sometimes by replacing the action of characters with a movement of world. But we do not in this way leave behind an indirect representation, even though we come close, in certain exceptional cases, to doors of time that already belong to modern cinema. However, in these very cases, the recollection image or the dream image, the Nemo sign or the Oniro sign, are gone beyond, for these images in themselves are virtual images, which are linked with the actual optical or sound image description, but which are constantly being actualized on their own account, or the former and the latter to infinity. For the time image to be born, on the contrary, the actual image must enter into relation with its own virtual image as such. From the outset, pure description must divide in two, repeat itself, take itself up again, fork, contradict itself, an image which is double-sided, mutual. Both actual and virtual must be constituted. We are no longer in the situation of a relationship between the actual image and other virtual images, recollections or dreams, which thus become actual in turn. This is still a mode of linkage. We are in the situation of an actual image and its own virtual image, to the extent that there is no longer any linkage of the real with the imaginary, but indiscernibility of the two, a perpetual exchange. This is a progress in relation to the op sign. We saw how the crystal, the hyalo sign, ensures the dividing in two of description and brings about the exchange in the image which has become mutual, the exchange of the actual and the virtual, of the limpid and the opaque, of the seed and the surrounding. By raising themselves to the indiscernibility of the real and the imaginary, the signs of the crystal go beyond all psychology of the recollection or dream, and all physics of action. What we see in the crystal is no longer the empirical progression of time as succession of presents, nor its indirect representation as interval or as whole. It is its direct presentation, its constitutive dividing into a present which is passing, and a past which is preserved. The strict contemporaneity of the present with the past that it will be, of the past with the present that it has been. It is time itself which arises in the crystal, and which is constantly recommending its dividing in two, without completing it, since the indiscernible exchange is always renewed and reproduced. The direct time image, or the transcendental form of time, is what we see in the crystal, and hyalo signs and crystalline signs should therefore be called mirrors or seeds of time. Thus we have the chronosigns, which mark the various presentations of the direct time image. The first concerns the order of time. This order is not made up of succession, nor is it the same thing as the interval or the whole of indirect representation. It is a matter of the internal relations of time, in a topological or quantic form. Thus the first chronosign has two figures. Sometimes it is the coexistence of all the sheets of past with the topological transformation of these sheets, and the overtaking of psychological memory towards a world memory. This sign can be called sheet, aspect, or facies. Sometimes it is the simultaneity of points of present, these points breaking with all external succession and carrying out quantic jumps between the presents which are doubled by the past, the future, and the present itself. This sign can be called point or accent. We are no longer in an indiscernible distinction between the real and the imaginary, which would characterize the crystal image, but in undecidable alternatives between sheets of past, or inexplicable differences between points of present, which now concern the direct time image. What is in play is no longer the real and the imaginary, but the true and the false. And just as the real and the imaginary become indiscernible in certain, very specific conditions of the image, the true and the false now become undecidable or inextricable. The impossible proceeds from the possible. and the past is not necessarily true. A new logic has to be invented, just as earlier a new psychology had to be. It seemed to us that Resnius went furthest in this direction of coexisting sheets of past, and Robbe-Grillet in that of simultaneous peaks of present, hence the paradox, and etc. But in any event, the time image has arisen through direct or transcendental presentation as a new element in post-war cinema, and Wells was master of the time image. There is still another type of chronosign which on this occasion constitutes time as series. The before and after are no longer themselves a matter of external empirical succession, but of the intrinsic quality of that which becomes in time. Becoming can in fact be defined as that which transforms an empirical sequence into a series, a burst of series. A series is a sequence of images which tend in themselves in the direction of a limit, which orients and inspires the first sequence, the before, and gives way to another sequence, organized as series, which tends in turn towards another limit, the after. The before and the after are then no longer successive determinations of the course of time, but the two sides of the power, or the passage of the power to a higher power. The direct time image here does not appear in an order of coexistences or simultaneities, but in a becoming as potentialization, as series of powers. This second type of chronosign, the genosign, has therefore also the property of bringing into question the notion of truth, for the false ceases to be a simple appearance, or even a lie, in order to achieve that power of becoming, which constitutes series or degrees, which crosses limits, carries out metamorphoses, and develops along its whole path an act of legend, of storytelling, beyond the true or the false, becoming as power of the false. Genosigns present several figures in this case. Sometimes they are characters forming series as so many degrees of a will to power, through which the world becomes a fable. Sometimes it is a character himself crossing a limit, and becoming another in an act of storytelling which connects him to a people past or to come. We have seen the paradox by which this cinema was called cinema verite, at the moment that it brought every model of the true into question, and there is a double becoming superimposed, for the author becomes another as much as his character does. Sometimes again, in the third place, characters dissolve of their own accord, and the author is effaced. There are now only attitudes of bodies, corporeal postures, forming series, and a jest which connects them together as limit. It is a cinema of bodies which has broken all the more with the sensory motor schema, through action being replaced by attitude, and supposedly true linkage by the jest which produces legend or storytelling. Sometimes, finally, the series, their limits and transformations, the degrees of power, may be a matter of any kind of relation of the image. Characters, states of one character, positions of the author, attitudes of bodies as well as colors, aesthetic genres, psychological faculties, political powers, logical or metaphysical categories. Every sequence of images forms a series in that it moves in the direction of a category, in which it is reflected, passage of one category to another determining a change of power. Everything which functions as limit between two series divided into two parts, the before and the after constituting the two sides of the limit, will also be called a category, a character, a jest, a word, a color may be a category as easily as a genre, from the moment that they fulfill the conditions of reflection. The so-called classical image had to be considered on two axes. These two axes were the coordinates of the brain. On the one hand, the images were linked or extended according to laws of association, of continuity, resemblance, contrast, or opposition. On the other hand, associated images were internalized in a whole as concept, integration, which was in turn continually externalized in associable or extendable images, differentiations. This is why the whole remained open and changing at the same time as a set of images was always taken from a larger set. This was the double aspect of the movement image. Defining the out of field, in the first place, it was in touch with an exterior. In the second place, it expressed a whole which changes. Movement in its extension was the immediate given, and the whole which changes, that is, time, was indirect or mediate representation. But there was a continual circulation of the two here, internalization in the whole, externalization in the image, circle or spiral, which constituted for cinema, no less than for philosophy, the model of the true as totalization. This model inspired the neuroscience of the classical image, and there were necessarily two kinds of neuroscience. In the first kind, the images were linked by rational cuts, and formed under this condition an extendable world. Between two images or two sequences of images, the limit as interval is included as the end of the one or as the beginning of the other, as the last image of the first sequence or the first of the second. The other kind of neuroscience marked the integration of the sequences into a whole, self-awareness as internal representation, but also the differentiation of the whole into extended sequences, belief in the external world, and from one to the other the whole was constantly changing. At the same time as the images were moving, time as measure of movement thus ensured a general system of commensurability in this double form of the interval and the whole. This was the splendor of the classical image. The modern image initiates the reign of incommensurables or irrational cuts. This is to say that the cut no longer forms part of one or the other image, of one or the other sequence, that it separates and divides. It is on this condition that the succession or sequence becomes a series, in the sense that we have just analyzed. The interval is set free. The interstice becomes irreducible and stands on its own. The first consequence is that the images are no longer linked by rational cuts, but are relinked onto irrational cuts. By relinkage must be understood not a second linkage, which would come and add itself on, but a mode of original and specific linkage, or rather a specific connection between delinked images. There are no longer grounds for talking about a real or possible extension capable of constituting an external world. We have ceased to believe in it, and the image is cut off from the external world. But the internalization or integration of self-awareness in a whole has no less disappeared. The relinkage takes place through parceling, whether it is a matter of the construction of series or the transformation of sheets as relinked parcelings. This is why thought, as power which has not always existed, is born from an outside more distant than any external world, and as power which does not yet exist, confronts an inside, an unthinkable or unthought, deeper than any internal world. In the second place, there is no longer any movement of internalization or externalization, integration or differentiation, but a confrontation of an outside and an inside, independent of distance. This thought outside itself and this unthought within itself. This is the unsummonable, the undecidable, the inexplicable, the impossible, the irrational. The brain has lost its Euclidean coordinates and now emits other signs. The direct time image effectively has as nuosigns the irrational cut between non-linked but always relinked images, and the absolute contact between non-totalizable, asymmetrical outside and inside. We move with ease from one to the other because the outside and the inside are the two sides of the limit as a rational cut, and because the latter, no longer forming part of any sequence, itself appears as an autonomous outside, which necessarily provides itself with an inside. The limit or interstice, the irrational cut, pass especially between the visual image and the sound image. This implies several novelties or changes. The sound must itself become image, instead of being a component of the visual image. Speech reaches its own limit, which separates it from the visual, but the visual reaches its own limit, which separates it from sound, so each one reaching its own limit which separates it from the other, thus discovers the common limit which connects them to each other, in the incommensurable relation of an irrational cut, the right side and its obverse, the outside and the inside. These new signs are lectosigns, which show the final aspect of the direct time image, the common limit. The visual image becomes stratigraphic, is for its part all the more readable in that the speech act becomes an autonomous creator. Classical cinema was not short on lectosigns, but only to the extent that the speech act was itself read in the silent film, or in the first stage of the talkie, making it possible to read the visual image of which it was only one component. From the classical to modern cinema, from the movement image to the time image, what changes are not only the chronosigns, but the nuosigns and the lectosigns. Having said that it is always possible to multiply the passages from one regime to the other, just as to accentuate their irreducible differences. Cinema itself is a new practice of images and signs, whose theory philosophy must produce as conceptual practice, for no technical determination, whether applied, psychoanalysis, linguistic, or reflexive, is sufficient to constitute the concepts of cinema itself.